Welcome back. I'm Tian Wei. This is World Insight. Let's turn to another nuclear issue, this time on the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK's ruling party concluded its fifth plenary session of the Seventh Central Committee in Pyongyang. The meeting reiterated bringing prosperity through self-reliance. DPRK leader Kim Jong Un urged the ruling party to work harder for economic development and national defense. He also blamed the U.S. for stalled bilateral nuclear talks after the year-end deadline. He said he would restart the nuclear and long-range missile programs, which were suspended after his first meeting with the U.S. President Donald Trump in Singapore. Many believe this is a dangerous signal for not only denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but also for DPRK-U.S. ties. For more on the latest situation about that bilateral relationship and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, we are joined in Washington by Sharon Scassoni, who is a research fellow at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the Alien School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Meanwhile, we're also joined in Beijing by Zhao Tong, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. Jenny, go to you first. A response to the self-reliant and self-sustenance. Sharon.
Oh, hi. This is a little bit different than what Kim Jong Un has been saying, and I think it's not a terrible surprise, but it is a change in his policy. So basically, he's alerting his people to the fact that sanctions are not going to be lifted anytime soon, and that everyone needs to buckle their belt a little tighter. As for the impact on U.S. DPRK relations, we still need to wait and see what shocking, actionable, actual action North Korea takes.
All right. Now I'm also joined in Washington by Jenny Tang, research analyst at the Stimson Center and managing editor of 38 North. Welcome to our program as well. Jenny, I want to throw a question to you as well. What do you make of the connection, or at least the analysis one could do about what's going on in the Middle East and the urgency that the DPRK sees itself in terms of trying to further develop the nuclear program, earlier suspended to a certain degree already?
Well, I don't think the North Koreans are necessarily surprised at what's happening in the Middle East. I think this has been one of the reasons why they have justified their nuclear development in the past, is for actions like this, as they've seen with Iraq, with Libya in the past as well. So I think, if anything, this just reinforces the notion that there is a threat from the United States, even if it isn't necessarily an active threat all of the time. But because of the different political systems, because of the way that North Korea is run, that there is always this kind of looming threat in the air that they do have to protect themselves against.
We don't want to forget, Mr. Zhao from Beijing, that this is the announcement made by the DPRK leader after almost 2 years of trying to further engage with Washington, but so far the administration now has failed to deliver, at least in the DPRK's eyes, since the Singapore summit. So, Mr. Zhao, what's likely to be the next when you heard these phrases being used by the DPRK?
Well, I think now DPRK is prepared both ways. It is prepared to rely solely on itself for achieving its primary objective, which is economic development, which means he will focus, North Korean leader Kim Jong Un will focus on domestic internal measures, including economic reforms, or trying to raise the importance of science and technology development for domestic economic growth, and to rely more heavily on regional friendly countries for its economic development. But on the other side, I think North Korea's top priority is still to make some deal with the United States, simply to remove the external restraint on economic development. In that regard, it's likely that North Korea will continue stepping up the military tensions. From the North Korean perspective, making more military provocations would draw American attention and will force the United States to consider more seriously about making more concessions to North Korea.
I see. On the other hand, what about the U.S., Mrs. Guasoni, in Washington? Tell me about whether you are confident that this administration will be able to handle two crises going on at the same time, all about the denuclearization, or at least related to denuclearization.
This is the same. I think this is a question that every administration faces, really. You know, very few, I think, are able to handle more than one crisis at a time. And what's going on with Iran is really very troubling, as your listeners, watchers, heard in the earlier segment. For a long time, I think the Trump administration, or the White House, focused on North Korea because I think Mr. Trump thought he could get a great deal. And he was personally invested in a relationship with Kim Jong Un. But now that you know, there's a different crisis brewing with Iran, as well as impeachment going on, I think it's going to be very hard for Mr. Trump to get anything on the table with Kim Jong Un. And frankly, the North Koreans have not been very interested in negotiating with anyone besides Mr. Trump. You know, typically these are very complicated, sophisticated negotiations with a lot of technical details that happen, you know, at the working level. And so with Mr. Trump's attention detained elsewhere, I'm not very confident that we're going to see much happen in 2020.
Probably that has a lot to do with how Washington, particularly the administration, works. It's a final call always from the president. It seems that really counts. It should be in any administration, but this time, of course, it's very different and special. Ms. Tao, also go to you about that. Whether there is any possibility that with President Trump losing steam on the Iranian issue, there might be more maneuvering space for the others in the administration or in Washington who are familiar with the DPRK situation, be able to come up further and be able to work on it different in the logic from earlier.
Well, as Sharon said, I think there is a problem not in the U.S. will to negotiate, but in how the North Koreans are approaching the negotiations. One of the things that we've seen very clearly is that Kim Jong Un sees himself as part of the negotiating team itself, which makes it very difficult to have then working level meetings the way that we've done in past negotiations to work out the kind of details that Ms. Guasoni was talking about. So, you know, there is a role to be played now by President Trump if we were to get back to the table. But I think it was very clear from Kim Jong Un's remarks on New Year's Day or in the plenum meeting that they're not looking for negotiations right now, that they've basically accepted the idea that they need to strengthen their institutions and strengthen their economy in ways that accept the idea that sanctions are there now and that they're not going to get any sort of immediate relief. They may try again in the future and see how things play out over the next few months and maybe closer to the elections. But for right now, I think the door on the North Korean side is pretty closed.
All right. Mr. Zhao, well, people understand the fact that during the election year in the United States, the others have to be patient and extremely patient and extremely patient about anything. But the others feeling also unfair because they have to handle crisis. Not only Washington has to handle it, but two crises are also going on for the others as well, whether it's the Europeans or the Chinese or the Russians or the others at the United Nations. So what do you think will be the others' role in this regard, and how the others will interact with Washington or Pyongyang now about these two ongoing crises, Iran and the DPRK denuclearization?
Well, I think there is still hope for some interim deal between DPRK and the United States, and others see that possibility. That's why I think Russia and China recently have increased their diplomatic efforts to promote the political solution of the crisis. I think even though we understand that North Korea is willing to reach some interim deal, it's highly important that North Korea does not go ahead with more military provocations. So in that regard, I think China and Russia can play an important role in dissuading North Korea from conducting any long-range missile tests or things of that sort. On the other hand, I think there also need more persuasion from Beijing and Moscow to get word in Washington, D.C. that U.S. really needs to be more flexible in its approach in dealing with
Well, do you think under the current circumstances, will Beijing and Moscow be able to do that? I mean, for a current Washington?
I think it may have some persuasive power because Trump already has a crisis in Iran, and he really doesn't want to see another ICBM launch from DPRK.
Right.
And he might have a greater incentive to do things to prevent that from happening.
Right, but I still want to ask the other two guests briefly, certainly from Washington. Jenny, with the current crisis about Iran that the president has to handle as a result of his own policy choice, does he still convey that much power in Washington now, even on the issue of the DPRK nuclear issue?
Well, certainly the environment's very polarized here, but as it has been throughout most of his administration, I think there are big questions right now of his leadership, of his standing, of where things go in the impeachment process, of where the elections are going. And so I think it will be very difficult to get him to have a very focused policy on either of these issues going forward.
And Sharon, what's your view?
Well, I think if Americans had to choose between a war with Iran or a good deal with North Korea, you know, as something to build Trump up, we'd all choose a good deal with North Korea. You know, there is a sense, I agree completely with Jenny, the political atmosphere here is incredibly polarized, and the White House really, at least the staffers, have to be wondering how much can be done in the next year if Mr. Trump doesn't get elected. But I think that North Korea, if they play their cards right, it still holds the potential for a deal, for something positive. I don't think Iran, and whatever happens with Iran, is going to be very positive for the Trump administration.
I noted down all your views. At this point, we'll see how things will evolve from the current situation. A lot of crisis around. We'll see how it goes. Thank you so much, Jenny Tang, Sharon Squassoni, Zhao Tong. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, and also try to check out our YouTube channel, Twitter, and Facebook account. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time. More insights across China and around the world. Good night.